Across the Atlantic, the peoples of Europe are emerging from the wreckage of one of the most devastating wars the world has ever known. In the 5 years since VE Day, post-war recovery has moved steadily forward. There is food in the marketplaces, and the pitiful bread lines are becoming memories. The bomb rubble is being cleared away, and men are building for a peace they hope will endure. How has American aid helped in this recovery of Europe? What are the problems ahead? How is the food, and are there homes for all? And what do the people of Europe think of Americans? These are some of the questions that we in America are asking today. Seeking the answer to these and many other questions about post-war recovery in Europe, 65 Americans from 41 states and Washington, D.C. arrived by domestic airlines at New York to embark upon a pioneer venture in international understanding. The world's first overseas flying classrooms, sponsored by Michigan State College. Leaders in public education from the states represented predominated in the group, which was to visit 11 European countries by air during the next 6 weeks. All present and accounted for, 65 Americans as typical as apple pie, and all eager for the adventure ahead. All aboard, please. This was the first ocean crossing for most of the party, and the first long-distance plane flight for some. 3,500 horsepower in each of the four motors waits patiently for the captain's command to roar into life. Afternoon shadows lengthen across the airport as the Stratocruiser taxis out for the takeoff. Dinner tonight will be served over the Atlantic. The biggest city in the world is a toy town below. Speaking of dinner, here is food to tempt an epicure. No wonder everyone aboard the big plane suddenly acquires a tremendous appetite. A sunset from 5 miles above the Atlantic is something to dream about as you settle down for the night on your way to Paris. And here it is, Europe, France, Paris, with the Seine sparkling in the morning sun. A beautiful day, a wonderful trip, an auspicious start for the flying classroom. It hardly seems possible that Paris is only an overnight trip from New York. As their plane taxis to the air terminal, the flying classroom recalls another flight from America, the flight of Lindbergh, the lone eagle, only a brief 23 years before. Today's welcoming committee for a transocean flight is strictly routine. Airport police who courteously direct passengers in French, the airport hostess who explains the directions in English. It's spring, and trees along the boulevards of Europe have put on their fresh coats of green. In April, Paris skies are bluest, the clouds at their whitest, for the opening of another tourist season. Of course, the flying classroom saw the Eiffel Tower and the majestic cathedral at Notre Dame, a classic fortunately spared by the war. During the next 6 weeks, the group saw much of Western Europe that is seen by the casual tourist, the Colosseum at Rome, St. Peter's Cathedral, thronged by thousands of religious pilgrims celebrating Holy Year, the picturesque cities of busy Switzerland tucked away among the towering Alps, and the bombed cities of Germany, terrible monuments to the futility and destruction of modern war. They saw Copenhagen's sparkling fountain of Gefion, depicting one of the incidents of Scandinavian mythology in which a ruling queen transformed her brothers into oxen. They found the mermaid reclining upon a rock at the entrance to Copenhagen's harbor and photographed the colorful King's Guard at the entrance to the royal palace. They saw ancient Danish castles surrounded by massive stone walls and guarded by deep moats, and watched the inevitable fisherman casting his nets into the turbulent waters in the heart of Stockholm. From their vantage point atop a convenient mountain, they looked down upon the busy harbor scene at Oslo Fort. And a few days later, they walked beside the canals of Holland. It was tulip time in Holland, and the fields were splashes of gorgeous color beneath the blue sky. They looked for windmills, too, And they found some thoughtfully maintained by the thrifty people of this tidy land. An international fair was in full swing in thriving Brussels, adding to the color and excitement of Belgium's industrious capital. In England, a few minutes away by air, there was historic Buckingham Palace. They watched the pageantry of the changing of the guard, and then motored the lovely English countryside to see Windsor Castle, the summer home of England's royal families. But the flying classroom was interested in more than Europe's traditional tourist attractions. They wanted to have a look behind the scenes to see how the people are living, how they are making a living, how they are governed, and to find out what has been accomplished by the billions of dollars expended through the Marshall Plan. They found willing cooperation from American embassy officials and among the Americans administering the ECA in Europe. In fact, ECA headquarters was a port of call in all of the Marshall Plan countries visited. From these conferences with ECA administrators, members of the flying classroom obtained a concise perspective of the nation's economy. Armed with charts, graphs, statistics, and reports, they could trace the general pattern of post-war recovery and understand better the problems yet to be solved. They visited industries, cooperatives, and nationalized factories. They talked with factory executives and with workmen in the shops. They visited farms and rural villages and talked with herdsmen along the highways. They attended special showings of documentary films depicting the industries and the life of the people. Conferences were a daily routine, even in a roof garden atop a cooperative factory. Special trips were arranged by boat, by bus, and by automobile to see Europeans at work and at play. They attended political meetings and May Day celebrations and heard communist orators attacking the democratic way of life and branding the Marshall Plan as dollar imperialism. They met with government leaders such as Chancellor Adenauer of Western Germany. The opposition point of view came from conferences with representatives of minority parties and of special group interests. Listening, questioning, observing, a picture of post-war Europe was formed in the minds of each of the 65 Americans. And when in London, the flying classroom looked back upon the countries visited, these pictures of Europe today merged into one. Sharply outlined in this composite picture of post-war Europe is the gnawing threat of communism. The people of Western Europe live in the shadow of Russia, and it is here where we must continue to concentrate our efforts against this menace. Of the 11 countries visited, Italy appears to be the most vulnerable to the inroads of communism. Widespread unemployment, the abject poverty of the people of southern Italy, and communist-dominated labor organizations in the northern industrial cities are serious problems to solve. America's Marshall Plan has played an important role in helping stem the tide of communism in Europe. Communism feeds on empty stomachs and futility, and the first assistance through Marshall Plan dollars provided food and clothing and hope for the future. When this emergency was met, the next step was to help Europe help itself along the road to recovery. Marshall Plan funds helped prime the pump of post-war European industrial recovery. In the period of stagnation following the war, there were factories and workers, but no materials. Marshall Plan dollars helped supply the raw materials necessary to start the wheels of industry turning for the production of sorely needed goods. European agriculture was at a low ebb of production after the war. There was need to rebuild herds, to restore the fertility of fields, to increase the production of food. But feed for livestock, fertilizer for the fields, and even seeds were lacking. Marshall Plan funds primed the pump for European agriculture, and food production has increased beyond pre-war levels in many of the countries. The recovery programs outlined to members of the flying classroom in the countries of Western Europe are based upon the concept of decreasing Marshall Plan aid each year, ending in 1952. It appears probable that most of these nations will by that time have achieved pre-war or better than pre-war production and trade, that currency will be stabilized and inflation checked, that most of the war damage will have been repaired, and that a decent standard of living will have been attained. The problem of trade between Europe and America will remain, however, and this problem cannot be solved by European efforts alone. To see for themselves how the people of post-war Europe are living, members of the flying classroom visited public marketplaces in the cities and towns along the way. They found food handled a bit differently than in the United States. The food situation in Europe is no longer critical thanks to the efforts of the Europeans themselves with the assistance of the Marshall Plan. The average person in Western Europe is consuming 2,800 calories of food a day compared to 2,900 calories before the war. In Italy, the daily diet is less than 2,000 calories. In the United States, the average is 3,200, over 50% more. The Italian worker spends 3/4 or more of his wages for just enough food, clothing, and shelter to exist. An hour's work will buy only 1/4 as much food in Italy, about 1/3 as much in Germany and France, and about 3/4 as much in Great Britain and the Scandinavian countries as it will in the United States. The housing problem of Western Europe is most acute in Germany and Italy, where many families are living in caves and ruins, and where the construction of housing units is proceeding slowly. The heavily bombed cities of Germany, for example, have approximately 1/2 of their pre-war population, and refugees from these cities are still scattered among the rural villages and farms. Government-financed housing projects are making some headway in solving the acute housing problems of Western Europe. In Norway, these homes were financed by government funds and are rented to workers. Regardless of its quality, housing in Western Europe is inexpensive because of government subsidies and because of rigid rent control laws. Rents range from $3 to $10 a month for family units in most of the countries. Sweden's good fortune in escaping the ravages of war is reflected in the beautiful apartment buildings, such as these, along the inland waterways of Stockholm. Switzerland, another European country that remained at peace, is ahead of its neighbors in housing. Individual home ownership is popular in this land of individual freedom, as it is in the United States. The recent war has left its scars upon the health of the people of Europe, and although these scars are healing, they still exist. The years in which there were shortages of food, poor sanitation, inadequate housing, and a lack of medical care are not written off in a few summers. So, governments of Western Europe are taking an active interest in the health of their people, and steps are being taken to remedy the bad effects of the war years. Good food and wholesome living, the foundation of all health programs, are reflected in the healthy appearance of the young folk of Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland, countries which had adequate supplies of food during the war. The national health programs of Western Europe differ with each country, but are largely operated on a cooperative basis, financed in part by the people, by industry, and by the government. Services include medical, dental, nursing, and hospital care. There are housing units for the aged and for pensioners, and day nurseries for children whose mothers must work. Holland's health program is an example of the way one country solved its health problems in terms of its own needs. As Dr. Banning, head of Holland's National Health Service, explained to this flying classroom group, the Dutch health program is based upon the theory of private enterprise. The people participating help pay for the services they receive by direct contributions. Although the amounts contributed may be small, Dr. Banning declared that these contributions have a morale building as well as financial value. In Britain, where so-called socialized medicine has been provided by the government, There is considerable controversy regarding the administration of the program. There is evidence that England's present program was developed too hastily, that professional personnel and equipment is inadequate for the job to be done, and that the cost has added too much of a burden to the heavily taxed people of Britain. There is criticism from patients and doctors that the quality of medical care is poor, and that there is too much delay in providing certain health services, such as eyeglasses and tonsil operations. The majority of doctors and leaders of both parties agree, however, that some form of national health service is needed. The people of Europe appear to spend more time at home than do Americans. The family automobile is practically non-existent, and recreation must be sought close at hand. On pleasant Sundays, many families board the streetcars with picnic baskets and sports equipment for an outing in the parks. Outdoor cafes are popular places to spend the time. Gardening is a profitable hobby, and community garden plots are frequent in the suburban areas. Where there is water near at hand, a family is more likely to own a sailboat for recreation than an automobile. In many European cities, bicycles are more of a traffic hazard than automobiles. And when Dad sets out for a Sunday morning spin, Junior goes along too, in the rumble seat. Pageants, celebrations, holidays, traveling carnivals, and similar events play important roles in the recreational life of European families. There was evidence that Europeans provide more of their own entertainment than do Americans. A lack of modern appliances in the home places more responsibility on the family for the performance of household chores, which are simplified by mechanical devices in America. In most of Europe, for example, the mother must shop every day because she does not have refrigeration in the home. Dramatic evidence of the influence of religion upon the lives of the people of Europe was demonstrated by the throngs of pilgrims visiting Rome during this holy year. The flying classroom was privileged to see Pope Pius and were deeply impressed by the fervor of the thousands who crowded into St. Peter's Cathedral. A desire for security appears to have influenced both management and labor in European industry. There has been more interest in protection than in competition. European industry has developed a fondness for cartels, huge combines or monopolies in which production, profits, and markets are tightly regulated. The cartel system has been a major factor in limiting the initiative of management and workers in the development of new products and services. Wages of Europe's industrial workers are considerably less than those received by Americans, based either upon comparisons of currency values or in the terms of amount of goods an hour's work will purchase. Wages of industrial workers averaged from $20 to $25 a week in most of Western Europe. A skilled watchmaker in Switzerland makes twice that much. Food and housing, however, are cheaper than in America. European workers are taxed heavily in comparison to workers in the United States, and a larger portion of Europe's taxes are used to finance their social programs. They have more complete coverage than American workers for unemployment insurance, old age pensions, accident and health insurance, and government-subsidized housing and food. But his taxes for these benefits are so great that often the incentive to produce more is stifled because of the increased taxes which would result from any increase in his income. One of the problems of European industry today is to make and sell goods in a dollar market which has an abundance of the same type of products at the same or at a lower price. The Scandinavian countries, for example, have abundant resources of timber for which there is a ready market in England and the sterling areas. But wood products from Scandinavia face difficult competition in the dollar market of America because we have access to timber at home or from Canada. Employment of women workers for factory jobs, which in America would normally be done by men, was noted in several of the countries visited. In one steel mill, women were operating huge cranes that handled massive crucibles of molten metal. One European observer listed 3 factors in explaining why industrial productivity in the United States was from 50 to 90% greater than in Europe. In America, competition is stressed above security. There is better planning by management, and Americans have developed horsepower techniques. Under the Marshall Plan, production teams of European workers are visiting the United States to see American industrial know-how in action. The art of making fine pottery, as it has been developed in Denmark, Holland, Belgium, England, and Finland, is expected to continue as a craft. Most of these luxury-type products will be sold in the dollar market. In fact, Europe's place in the world of trade, in which there is competition with highly industrialized nations such as the United States, depends to a great extent upon the further development of industries requiring fine workmanship of many hands. No country in Europe has the variety of natural resources that are available to the United States or to Russia. Norway, for example, has an abundance only of water power, timber, and fish. The Schuman Plan is a step toward pooling the resources of Western Europe in an economic union, a goal that even the most optimistic admit will likely take decades to accomplish. Evidence of the scope of European post-war recovery was found by the flying classroom in some of the industrial fairs and exhibits attended. Italy's Milan Fair attracted buyers from all nations of the world, as did the British Trades Fair, which was visited by members of the flying classroom while in London. Overseas buyers, particularly those from the dollar countries, received a warm welcome at Britain's trade fair. British manufacturers long for mass markets such as are enjoyed by American industries with their 150 million potential customers in 48 states, unhampered by tariffs, quotas, and other trade barriers. Although Britain's experiments in social legislation, such as their National Health Service, have been publicized most in the United States, the present Labour government of England is basing its case fundamentally upon full employment. And members of the flying classroom found many Britishers who questioned whether their present government could have accomplished either of these goals without help from the Marshall Plan. Europe's one-horse farming on tiny fields was a constant source of amazement to members of the flying classroom, particularly those representatives from the rich Midwest farming sections. In Europe, land is scarce and labor is abundant. Maximum food production per acre is of much more importance than the efficient use of labor according to American standards. Farms are small and in many cases considerable distance from the village in which the farmer lives. Agricultural production in Europe was 95% of pre-war in 1949 and was even more favorable in 1950. Intensive agricultural production has been carried to extremes that seemed almost unbelievable to Americans. In Holland and Belgium, for example, fruits and vegetables are grown extensively under glass. Entire crews of workers thin grapes by hand to increase the size and quality of the harvest. They saw entire orchards of peaches and cherries under glass, and even sampled tree-ripened cherries in May. In Italy, the total cash income of many farm families averages only $200 a year. On this farm along the road to Anzio, 3 generations were living under one roof. It is futile for young Italian farmers to even hope that someday they may own their own land. Work is scarce, and when it can be had, the pay is so little that all must go for the bare necessities of life. Fuel for the family hearth and for cooking comes from prunings of the vineyards, which are carefully gathered and bound into bundles. Where land is expensive and cultivation is intensive, farm animals are few because of the scarcity of feed. One solution to meet production on small farms is small animals, although these rabbits seem to have been crossed with antelopes. At the end of a 10-hour day, these 2 men will have sprayed only 1 or 2 acres of fruit trees. In contrast, one man can spray 30 to 40 acres of trees in a day with his American-made automatic power sprayer. Farm machinery is being made available through the Marshall Plan. The prosperity of Switzerland is reflected in the picturesque farms in the mountain valleys. Farmers the world around are justly proud of fine livestock, and this Swiss farmer is no exception to the rule. In Denmark, agricultural cooperatives not only provide marketing services, but also assist young farmers in purchasing their own farms through long-time, low-interest loans. Although farm labor is abundant in Denmark, progressive Danish farmers are not overlooking opportunities to utilize mechanical devices to make their farm operations more efficient. Most of the butter and cheese from this herd of cattle is destined for England, the traditional market for dairy farm products. Further evidence that communism is losing ground in Europe was found in membership of the various elected parliaments of the countries visited. After a gain immediately following the war, the communists have lost votes in members of parliament in those countries. Government-financed social services and ownership of public utilities and railroads prevails in most countries of Western Europe. A definite policy of expanding social legislation, of which government-subsidized housing is an example, is included in the platforms of most political parties in Europe. Trade barriers to Europe's economic union, such as customs regulations and separate monetary systems, are encountered at first hand by members of the flying classroom. During their 6-week visit, they struggled with problems of 11 different currencies and obtained clearance papers from customs officials for their personal belongings 24 times. The need of tax reforms, particularly in France and Italy, was found to be one of the pressing problems of European governments to ensure economic and political stability. Europe's ability to defend herself against such a power as Russia was found to be more symbolic than actual. In the face of threatening aggression from the East, the defense of Europe is mounting in importance as a problem to be solved by cooperative action. Compulsory military training has been a part of the defense programs of European nations for many years. These civilian soldiers must keep their shooting eyes sharp, and target practice is held often. With memories of the recent World War still painfully vivid, most of Europe's government leaders favor cooperative defense programs such as the Atlantic Pact. Europe's most important people, her children, were of special interest to members of the flying classroom, and many a postman's holiday was taken to visit schools. In Italy, they found educational standards considerably lower than in the United States. Education in Italy is compulsory for children from ages 6 to 11. Only 12% of the children in elementary schools continue their education, compared to 65% in the United States. A generation of children who have known nothing but war, devastation, and defeat is found in Germany's schools. Here, the occupation authorities are endeavoring to uproot the poisonous propaganda of the Nazis and to sow the seeds of democracy. Most responsive are the younger children to whom the Hitler youth are but dim figures of a hazy past. Proud of their new leather breeches, these young Germans face a clouded future in a nation divided into two armed camps of East and West. Switzerland, one of the few nations of the world in which there is no illiteracy, is justly proud of its schools. Europe's institutions of higher learning, such as Stockholm's University of Uppsala, continue to attract American scholars. Here they find a classical type of education with courses advanced and rigorous. Until recently, much of Britain's education has been left to private initiative and to the church. Now, public education, as we know it in America, is being greatly extended. Secondary education has been highly selective in Britain, with only 10% of children in junior schools being admitted. The Education Act of 1944, however, is designed to make secondary education of some sort compulsory and free. After inspecting European schools, there was a higher regard for American education. There was evidence of a greater appreciation for the democratic way of life in America as the group boarded the homeward-bound plane in London after their 11-nation flying study of Western Europe. Memories of Europe's traditional tourist attractions were overshadowed by what they had learned of these nations' problems in probing behind the scenes. Above all, they had learned that world trade and understanding among nations is not a one-way street. Those who would sell must buy, and those who would persuade must first seek to understand. Members of this first overseas flying classroom voted it the greatest educational experience of their lives. And the hope was expressed that this pioneer venture in the use of air travel for organized study of other nations would be duplicated many times in the future. The overseas flying classroom was another demonstration of leadership in international understanding, further evidence to the free people of the world of American sincerity in furthering understanding and goodwill among people of all nations.